Thanks very much for the opportunity, and thanks very much for the role that Nuffield plays. I think Nuffield is probably a bit of a hidden gem in terms of agriculture. I think the network and the intellect that is around the Nuffield room and the perceptions of the wider agricultural sector that scholars come back with is absolutely fantastic for the future of agriculture. So it's always a pleasure to interact with and get to talk to some of the people involved. Your theme is about change and making change happen, or how changes happen. And it struck me that of all the sectors of a modern economy, agriculture is the only one, in a sense, that hasn't been industrialised. So if you think of manufacturing, you think of a lot of the service industries, they're industrialised. So once you get an operating model, you can replicate that and you can build up into a very large corporation, and that's certainly what we see in virtually every other sector of the economy. The model where once you get it right, you franchise up or you build up, and you can take a lot of people out, automate a lot of decision making, and we're even starting to see it in the finance sector with robotic advisory services that are basically smart systems using computers. So agriculture is probably the only sector of the economy really that hasn't gone to that scale. In fact, we've seen, and I'm sure some of you are aware, we've seen efforts at corporatisation of agriculture, particularly broadacre agriculture, that have actually not worked very well. And the family business model is still prevailing. I think we're at an interesting point, because I think some of the developments we're starting to see now create the potential for an industrialised model of agriculture. And so if that came to pass, most of you in the room are redundant. We're going to franchise it and replicate it, create a board and a corporate structure, and most of the farms in Australia will be run remotely. Okay, so that's the challenging concept. And you might think, oh, he's been out in the sun too long, or hasn't been out in the sun long enough. But I actually saw a sugar farm in Brazil run exactly that way. The management all sat in an office in a major city and looked at screens all day and dictated management decisions from there, and they had a roving workforce that moved from one bit to the other, and it was all monitored and managed remotely. So it's not so far out of the realms of possibility that it's not worth at least conjecturing a bit about. So what I wanted to talk about today is some of these developments, and certainly some of your scholars have been talking about them and starting to get an understanding of the potential of some of these systems, particularly the digitised systems that we're starting to see become commonplace in agriculture. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about those, give you a bit of a feel for where things are up to, particularly in other jurisdictions, and start to think about what that might mean for the future of agriculture. So there's two concepts that people typically talk about in relation to these issues. One is big data, and big data is, you're all participants in it actually, you don't know it, but any one of you that's got a supermarket loyalty card is a participant in a big data application. So all the information collected associated with that loyalty card goes into the decision making of the major retailers, and they know to send you advertisements about particular products because they know on the patterns that they observe that people who bought this buy that, all that sort of stuff. So all of you are probably recipients or participants in big data systems, even though you don't know about it. So big data is really big data sets where you've got so much information in there that you do need special techniques to manage it, and it can be used to extract information and to make decisions and to work out probabilities of things happening. Digital agriculture is probably a scale under that in that it's agriculture which has got a lot of detailed digital information available, and we're starting to see that develop. But it's still at the individual farm level or something like that. So if we want to think about the examples, big data would be the analysis of all the yield maps from all the grain harvesters operating in Australia over a 5-year period, together with all the rainfall and other data to generate information about trends in yields and water use efficiency. So that would be a big data application, where obviously a digital agriculture application is one where you might use 5 years of yield maps from a specific paddock to enable an agronomist to develop a variable rate planting map for that paddock. So big data is starting to appear in agriculture, and it will come on the back of digital agriculture, which is a bit more common, and certainly which some of your scholars have been talked about. So if we look at the evolution of digital agriculture, it probably started with machinery that had some smarts about it, GPS controlled traffic, those sorts of things. It's moved on to equipment that is connected. So in other words, that equipment can communicate beyond the paddock. It's then moved on to farm equipment systems, where it's not just the tractor, but it's the seeder, the harvester, they're all interconnected. And it's now moving on to systems of systems, where physical data about the farm, some of the management data, certainly the machinery data and the production data is all integrated into one system. So you can imagine the complexities associated with having all those bits of a farm operation talk to each other. They're the sort of systems that are starting to be developed now, and that's where this issue of whether in fact this is the precursor to industrialising agriculture and making us all redundant, or a lot of us, starts to get raised as a question. Of course, there's some limitations to it, and I'm sure if I ask for hands up, the number of you that have got yield maps sitting around the office or on a hard drive clogging it up, the hands would go up, and if I asked you how many have made use of that, there wouldn't be as many hands go up. But the reality of this sort of stuff is that a yield map from a single paddock in a single year really doesn't have a huge amount of value. A series of yield maps over an extended period of time on the same area does have more value, but then data on all the fields in a country like the US over a period of time starts to become quite valuable from a big data perspective. It starts to get to the point where you can certainly make probabilistic decisions on the basis of the information you have, and they start to become useful from the point of view of a farm manager. And the real challenge, of course, is, and some of your scholars again have talked about it, is how to integrate this data, how to make it more than just a pile of information that is too confusing to do anything about. And that's what we're starting to see. So we're starting to see stacked layers of information. For example, some of the systems in the US are working with 9 or 10 stacked layers and integrating all that information to try and make sense of it, capturing it, and then some, but certainly very limited numbers, are applying algorithms to actually make it end up with a decision on the ground. Most typically in a variable rate variable rate map for a variable rate seeder, for example. But the crucial bit is the algorithm, and that's certainly where I think most of the challenge lies at the moment. But there are already developments where those sort of things are starting to occur. So if we look at the sort of things that are happening, certainly precision ag equipment, most of you would be familiar with that. There's either manufacturers or there's control systems that are interchangeable. The data warehouses, they're starting to be much more common, and there's certainly a few developing here in Australia. AgWorld is one. I think Phoenix has versions of it, and there's Farmware and a few others, and Back Paddock. So we're starting to see the situation where you can capture that paddock level or farm level data and have it stored somewhere convenient so you can retrieve it. The retailer software, so the software used by agronomists, for example, or fertiliser and chemical salesmen, that's actually much more common than most of us understand. In fact, I think I saw SST software with a claim that over 1 million hectares of Australian cropland has been mapped using its technology. So that's the software that's mainly used by agronomists and crop advisors to order and to map what's going on. Then the smart models, which incorporate all sorts of different pieces of information. There's really only a few of them. There's certainly Climate Corporation has got some work going on in that area and has products on the market. FarmLink, which is a US-based system, more a benchmarking system than anything else is there. AgSolver and even big companies like IBM are starting to move into that area. So I guess the ultimate goal is at the far end, and what we're seeing is a progression down that pathway as developments occur. So if we look at the current market in the US, there's at least 100 companies active in that area. Quite a few startups, quite a few big companies. Virtually all new crop machinery is data enabled, and much is internet enabled as well. So we're starting to see tractors and headers and harvesters and seeders that are and spray rigs that are communicating constantly on the internet. There's a large and competitive market for data storage and management. So you've even seen companies like Amazon and some of those Google come into the market, and through some of the retailers offer storage and those sorts of capacity. Retailers and seed companies are very competitive in the provision of different software tools. So a lot of the time it's used to help the farmer order inputs and then put together a variable map for different zones within a single paddock, or field, sorry, I should say. And then the predictive modelling is just starting to appear. Climate Corp is probably the main one that started to do that. So that's where it's actually making decisions. In other words, telling the farmer what they should be doing rather than just providing the information and acting as decision support. And obviously a very competitive market in the US for farm software tools. So just looking at a few examples of those. The interesting one is the ClimatePro. So those of you who don't know the story, Climate Corporation was a company in the US that was started by some ex-Google participants, and they bought all the data for all the weather stations in the US over about a 60-year period. Predominantly it was to use that data to work on probabilities for insurance companies. So the service that they were providing was an actuarial service almost for insurance companies. Then they were taken over by Monsanto, and Monsanto connected up all the field and variety trial data that they had with all the weather data that Climate Corp had, and they also added in the fairly intensive soil maps that the US government makes available publicly. And that led to the development of a range of different products. In fact, the Climate Basic product this year was used on 40 million acres of corn growing in the US. So it's grown up very quickly. And it's interesting the difference. The initial version of the products that Monsanto put out was called Field Scripts, and it basically was a recipe that could be plugged into your precision planter controller, which is also made by Monsanto, and it could apply a variable rate sowing regime to your crop. The climate version that's come out takes an entirely different approach and says, well, what do you think you should do? And you tell it, and then it shows you what the consequences of that are. So in other words, it's a decision support tool rather than providing you with script. And the rate of uptake of that, 40 million acres mapped in just on 12 months. So very rapid uptake of products that help you make decisions as opposed to products that tell you what to do. So I think there's probably an interesting lesson there. Another interesting one is FarmLink. So FarmLink started off as a company that leased harvesters for contractors. They realised that all the yield maps that those harvesters were creating might potentially have some value. They then encountered the problem of calibration, that The yield maps were in fact plus or minus 10%, depending on how well the harvester was calibrated. They implemented a program to sort that out, and then they implemented some technology to basically transmit the yield map straight from the harvester back to a central database, and that created a benchmarking system, because they could also access the rainfall and the soil data from public resources, and then they were able to create a benchmarking service that allowed, for example, crop advisors to come in and say, well, compared to people on very similar situations, here's how your crop yielded, here's the sort of things we're going to have to start to look at. So that FarmLink model has grown very quickly as well, and is widely used by crop advisors in the US to assist in informing their clients. Some of you might be familiar with John Deere. It started off as JD Link, which was a machinery machinery monitoring system, and now it's evolved into My John Deere, which is it's actually a data storage platform. So it's not just a platform for machinery data coming from the John Deere equipment, but in fact it's yield data, it's all the other things as well. And it's interesting what's happened in the US, and you can see it in the next slide, which is the ClimatePro delivery model. I think there's probably the initial attempt was to make it all proprietary. In other words, if you're going to have John Deere equipment, you can only use the John Deere software. I think fairly quickly entrepreneurs worked out how to get around that, and it was fairly quickly evident that if farmers had a red tractor, a green harvester and a blue sprayer, that they all should be able to talk to each other and integrate the data. And so there's actually an open data access protocol developed in the US, which means that all the sorts of different systems, Case IH, whatever, all can feed into a platform such as the Climate Corp one, and then quite a range of different applications can extract the information out of that, and then start to use it either to provide advice or to control machinery, etc. So fairly quickly, without much time at all, it evolved from a system where companies were trying to lock up the data to ones where they recognised that if they didn't make their data open access, people wouldn't be using their equipment. So that's certainly an interesting development. So if we look at the business models that are there at the moment, they certainly started off as product loyalty. So in other words, here's an enhancement if you buy our equipment. You get all this extra digital system with it. And then they fairly quickly realised, as I said, that that wasn't necessarily going to work purely as a product loyalty. Most of them are now starting to charge, and in fact US farmers are paying in the range of $3 to $10 an acre to access these services. And what they've found is that farmers are interested in them from a point of view of cost reduction, and of course you can understand that in the US Corn Belt, where they might be putting on 700 or 800 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, and a small saving in that is actually quite an important benefit in terms of the profitability of the farm. And they've certainly said that the interesting thing is that that's easier to sell, a cost reduction, than a yield improvement. And the concern, I guess, in some quarters is, well, won't governments start to use this information for compliance? In other words, for enforcing requirements on farmers. And certainly, I think we'll see that grow, but at this stage it's much less an issue in the US than it is in Australia, I think, in some of the thinking. In terms of the farmers that are using this, it's interesting, the target market isn't the leading innovators. So the leading innovators, the view is that quite a few of them reckon they can beat these systems and therefore don't need the help. But as one of the executives said to me, it's the lazy middle. It's the ones who know they should do better, but for whatever reason haven't gotten around to getting themselves sorted out yet. So in terms of bringing about change, that's quite an interesting model, because certainly the efforts of extension systems over many years have been, how do we get the late adopters and the laggards to start to move into higher levels of productivity and pick up some of the new innovations. And what they're finding is that that's the group who are quite interested in these, because it helps them make their decisions and makes it a bit easier for them. So quite an interesting set of developments occurring there. In terms of the savings, there's been quite a fair bit of work done, and moving from that paddock average management down to a square metre management is starting to, or is being identified as saving between 10 and 15% per hectare or per acre. So there's certainly, that's why certainly the corn growers are paying to access these services, because they're seeing that sort of return from moving from that paddock average treatment down to the square metre management level. And I guess the other point, which of course we need to keep in mind, is the inputs into a corn operation are much, much higher than what we would see in our dryland broadacre cropping. So the scale of savings that might be available are obviously much more significant. I think the interesting thing though is summed up in this slide in terms of where we're going into the future. So if we think about it in these terms, it's all gone blank, that's what'll happen. Pre-data, your ability to produce output really depended on farmer skills. And when we get back to that first issue, the reason agriculture hasn't been industrialised the same way manufacturing has is because individual farmers at the individual paddock or the individual farm level developed up that skill, and that was very difficult to replicate. And therefore that was where farms stayed at the sort of scale that we understand has been the case. Then as data-enabled machinery and cheap sensors started to emerge, we've started to see computer interpretation of data becoming more significant. And I guess the interesting question is where you think we are at the moment and where that might end up in the future. It's certainly not inconceivable in the more intensive industries to imagine a future, and certainly those of you that have a look at intensive poultry operations, for example, would know that the degree of computer control and monitoring occurring in those is quite high, and in fact the management skill has changed to one where you're trying to manage various inputs that the computer tells you are needed in order to achieve the output that the truck is coming in 2 weeks' time and it wants those birds at exactly that weight. So that sort of, in the intensive industries, that's already emerged. And I guess the interesting question from our perspective and from the industry perspective is where are we on that curve and where's it going to go to? Are we going to get to a point where managers will become less relevant, and in fact it'll be the data and the computer systems that start to make a lot more of the decisions? Data ownership and security is always an issue that people bring up. It's interesting, as I said, in the US, that was certainly initially a concern, but most have now gone to open access data systems. So in other words, they've realised that the data has to be exchangeable between different systems. That does create issues around ownership, but most now guarantee confidentiality. So the resistance and the pushback from farmers led to a situation where now, and if you look at the John Deere system, for example, it retains the right to the machine data. So in other words, the operating hours and the engine hours and those sorts of things. But it allows farmers to set access rights to all the production data, so the yield maps and all that sort of stuff. Monsanto Climate Corp give a guarantee that data remains secure and won't be transferred to third parties. So we're starting to see the market actually sort out those issues of privacy. I think the only qualification is data is generally accessible under subpoena. So in the case, for example, if we look at the GM crop, the Marsh versus Baxter one in Western Australia, if there was a need to prove that one of those farmers had taken specific action, and if there was technology involved that has these data capabilities, then it certainly would be accessible under a subpoena in terms of a court process. So, and that's no different, I guess, in some respects to your paddock notebook, for example. If push came to shove, courts could certainly subpoena those sorts of things in a case. So I'm not sure we're in much of a different situation. So what are the implications for Australian agriculture? We've certainly got much less input-intensive cropping systems, and I think that's probably more of a limit on farm-level adoption because the margins are smaller. The opportunity to actually add on the cost of data management systems and data collection systems is probably not as great, but certainly I think the potential is there. The retailers and resellers are already using this sort of technology as an input marketing tool. Some of us may not be aware of that, but certainly reasonably widespread. Lack of detailed soil weather data may limit progress in the more predictive software development. So I know CSIRO has AppSim, and that's been utilised in things like production-wise that grain growers produce, or the stuff that Birchip have been doing. But it's interesting that underpinning all the systems in the US is very intensive data collections around soil type and rainfall. So I think that's probably going to be a limit on these systems at this stage, although we're starting to see developments where, for example, individuals are putting in place quite high technology weather stations and starting to generate that data for themselves. So we're certainly seeing those sort of things occur here. As I said, the productivity potential in the change from paddock to square metre management, it's certainly been demonstrated in the US. Whether it's available in Australia is a bit harder to know. I mean, one of the things that it was pointed out to me is that corn, for example, is one plant that responds to planting density quite importantly. So by varying planting density, you can get quite significant production responses. So being able to control that has some advantages. Now, whether that's applicable to our systems, I guess, is another question. The other interesting thing is that the minute you talk to the Americans about these systems and say, well, how do you integrate a livestock system, they look at you with crossed eyes. Livestock simply and pasture simply don't register in these systems. So that may be an interesting situation in Australia, in that given our quite different production systems, whilst some of these are obviously applicable to a constant cropping regime, a rotating pasture cropping regime is probably not catered for in the bulk of them at this stage. So I think that will certainly be a challenging. The big dilemma, I think, in all this is that, and certainly the comments from the American farmers are similar to what you hear here, that, oh, we've generated all this data and it's not much use. I haven't been able to find any use for it. And the interesting thing is that the comments in America were, yeah, about 10 years is the tipping point. So about once you get to a stage where you've got reasonably comprehensive data being collected for about 10 years, it starts to get to the point where it's useful and people start to develop applications and start to make use of it. So it's almost a chicken and egg story where you need the data to make use of it, but while you're collecting it, it looks pretty useless on the way through. So I think these developments are going to happen. They're probably going to happen in different ways and a little bit more slowly in Australia. I don't think the individual farm manager is going to disappear just yet, but I think we are heading down the track where a whole range of different things in agriculture will change because of the nature of these sorts of platforms. So everything from your chemical record keeping to farm records to storing data about crop performance to even things like land values will start to be adjusted on the basis of some of this sort of information. So I think we're certainly at a very interesting time and one where the potential for change is great, and just how it spans out in the next few years will be quite interesting. So thank you.